All right, so the first case that we're going to do after Roe is Akron versus Akron Center for Reproductive Health. And a few things have changed on the court at this point. Most notably, the first female justice to join the Supreme Court, Justice Sandra O'Connor, has joined the court. Justice Sandra O'Connor is pretty much the story going forward of the next couple cases. And the reason for that is she joined the court with well-respected conservative accolades. And during President Reagan and some of President Bush's time, it was thought that with the increasing number of conservative jurists on the court, that Roe v. Wade was ultimately going to be overturned. It turns out that it was not, and that Justice O'Connor really provides the vote by which to save reproductive rights, just with a bit of a modification. We see the start of that in this case in 1883. So what specifically does this case do? Well, the city of Akron specifically passed a number of laws attempting to regulate the performance of an abortion. Among those being that all abortions performed after the first trimester must take place in a hospital. There must be parental consent for unmarried minors. Doctors were seen to counsel patients before they went through an abortion, a 24-hour waiting period, and that fetal remains has to be disposed of in a way that was humane and sanitary. So all of these laws sought to regulate the fundamental right of an abortion as articulated in Roe. And it was really one of the earliest shots across the bow by the states, in this case a city, but by the states largely, to chip away at the doctrine of Roe. And they do chip away at the doctrine of Roe here a little bit. So in this case, the issue is whether those regulations that I previously articulated run afoul of the 14th Amendment's right to privacy and thus the right to have access to abortion. And the court rules quite significantly that yes, they do. In a 6-3 decision articulated by Justice Powell, the court really states very clearly that the restrictions here run against the decision in Roe. But what's really important here is because what we're going to see over time is sort of the changing nature of the court. Because the majority opinion in this case, Justice Powell, largely defending his Roe v. Wade decision, simply articulates a strong and full-throated defense of the Roe doctrine. But Justice Connor sits in dissent in this case. Justice Connor's dissent, however, is confined to one very narrow area of the case and one very narrow area of Roe, and that is the trimester framework. Justice O'Connor says that the Roe framework is on a collision course with itself. She articulated a standard that the viability of a fetus will change over time as medicine advances, and that the viability of a fetus in this rigid trimester framework, we're basically going to collide at some point in which one becomes unworkable with the other. Because of this, Justice O'Connor poses another standard and says that abortion should be regulated by an unduly burdensome standard, which basically meant that if the regulation in question placed an undue burden on a woman's attempt to obtain abortion, that restriction would be unconstitutional. So we can see Justice O'Connor really signals where she's going to sit in this process and what her opinion is. She doesn't give a defense of Roe, so there was still some question in 1983 whether she truly wished to defend the rights of Roe, but she did provide and articulate a standard which was different from the Roe trimester framework standard. And this becomes her sort of conditioning way in which to view these cases going forward. And it also becomes the way in which the court views regulations upon a woman's right to an abortion going forward as well. A case that we don't cover, but we should talk about at least in some context, is a case known as Webster versus Reproductive Health Services. So a few things have changed when Webster takes place. So Webster takes place in 1989. President Reagan has made all 3 appointments to his court. And so some individuals thought that this was going to be the case in which overturned Roe. President Reagan now has a majority of conservatives on the court. He was very vocal about his opposition to abortion. And it was very clear that going into this case in 1989 that Justice O'Connor was going to play the decisive role here. She was going to decide which side ultimately wins. And she does, but she does so with a caveat. The majority in the case upholds all of the restrictions that exist in Webster, of which there are numerous, which we'll revisit in the next case we do Casey. But the majority upholds all of the restrictions, but Justice O'Connor concurs in the decision, but not in the majority opinion. So the majority opinion isn't really a majority, it's just a plurality. And the reason why she didn't join the majority opinion was because they sought to undo the fundamental right in Roe itself, and she simply did not agree with that. She held that the rights of the state to restrict abortion was permissible, but permissible under some standards. She says a regulation imposed on a lawful abortion is not unconstitutional unless it unduly burdens the right to seek an abortion. So Roe in Webster takes a pretty big hit, but also O'Connor comes as a defender. She argues against the trimester framework, ultimately upholds all of the restrictions that exist within Webster, but really positions herself as an individual, especially in the abortion debate, that was not going to be wholly in the conservative camp or wholly in the liberal camp. She articulated a different position, which is really sort of steers the court going forward, and we'll really see that debate and what ultimately happens take place in the next case that we're going to cover, which is Casey versus Planned Parenthood.